The airport buzzed with life. Travelers dragged suitcases across the shiny tiled floors. Announcements crackled over the speakers, and the faint smell of coffee drifted from overcrowded cafes. At Gate 12, a sleek airplane gleamed under the afternoon sun, its engines humming softly as passengers shuffled up the jet bridge. The flight was nearly full, and the crew moved with practiced ease, guiding people to their seats. It was just another day, or so it seemed. Edith Grayson stepped onto the plane, her small leather purse clutched in one hand. She was an older woman, maybe in her late 70s, with silver hair swept into a neat bun and a warm brown coat draped over her shoulders. Her steps were slow but steady, her eyes sharp with a quiet wisdom that came from years of watching the world turn. No one paid her much attention as she made her way down the narrow aisle toward business class. She didn't demand it. She didn't need to. Edith carried herself like someone who knew her worth, even if no one else did yet. She reached her seat, 8B, and lowered herself into it with a soft sigh. Her purse settled on the armrest beside her. The seatbelt lay draped across the cushion, its metal buckle glinting just out of easy reach. Edith stretched her hand toward it, her fingers brushing the strap. She tugged lightly, but it slipped from her grip. Her hands weren't as strong as they used to be. Age had a way of stealing little things like that. She tried again, this time with both hands, but they trembled slightly, and the buckle stayed stubbornly out of place. She paused, glancing up the aisle for help. A few rows ahead, Sarah Klein stood tall and poised, her Navy flight attendant uniform pressed to perfection. Her blonde hair was twisted into a tight bun, not a strand out of place, and her smile dazzled the first-class passengers she was chatting with. Sarah had been with Horizon Airlines for 6 years, and she knew how to word a flight. She laughed lightly at something a man in a crisp suit said, her voice smooth as she offered him a glass of water before takeoff. To her, this job was about picking who mattered and who didn't. The wealthy businessman sipping his drink, he mattered. The elderly woman fumbling with her seatbelt a few rows back, not so much. Edith cleared her throat softly, hoping to catch Sarah's eye. When that didn't work, she raised her voice just enough to be heard over the hum of the cabin. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her tone gentle. "Could you help me for a moment?" Sarah turned her head, her polite smile flickering for a split second. Her green eyes landed on Edith, then darted to the unbuckled seatbelt. She sighed quietly, the sound barely audible but heavy with irritation. "It's just a seatbelt, ma'am," she said, forcing the smile back into place. "Pull it across and click it in. You'll get it." She didn't move closer. She didn't offer to help. Instead, she turned back to the businessman, picking up their conversation as if Edith hadn't spoken. Edith nodded to herself, a small, knowing look crossing her face. She didn't push. She didn't complain. She just sat there, her hands resting in her lap, the seatbelt still unfastened. Next to her, Jake Harper watched the whole thing unfold. He was in his early 30s, dressed in a faded gray hoodie and jeans, his dark hair messy from running a hand through it too many times. He'd been scrolling through his phone when Edith sat down, but now his sharp brown eyes flicked between her and Sarah. He let out a quiet huff through his nose, leaning over slightly. "I can help," he said, keeping his voice low. Before Edith could protest, he reached across, grabbed the seatbelt, and clicked it into place with a quick snap. Edith turned to him, her smile warm and genuine. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice soft but steady. Jake gave a small nod, but his jaw tightened as he glanced at Sarah again. She was still laughing with the first-class passengers, her back turned like Edith didn't exist. "She should have done that," he muttered, almost to himself. Edith's smile didn't fade. "Some people choose who they see," she said quietly, "and who they don't." Jake frowned, her words sticking with him. There was something about the way she said it, calm, certain, like she'd seen this play out 100 times before. He didn't know why, but it made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. The plane was almost full now. Overhead bins snapped shut, and the last few passengers squeezed into their seats. Sarah moved through the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor, checking on people here and there. When she passed Edith's row, She didn't even glance her way. Instead, she stopped at the next seat over, flashing a bright smile at a woman in a designer jacket. "Need anything before takeoff?" she asked, her tone dripping with charm. The woman shook her head, and Sarah moved on, her focus locked on the front of the plane. Edith stayed quiet, her hands folded neatly over her purse. She didn't fidget or fuss, but there was a weight to her stillness, like a storm waiting to break. Jake noticed it. A few others did too. Passengers nearby who'd caught the exchange with Sarah. Some swapped quick looks, eyebrows raised. Others turned away, pretending they hadn't seen a thing. No one said anything out loud. Not yet. Up in first class, a man in a dark suit sat silently, his sharp gray eyes taking in every detail. Richard Tate hadn't spoken since boarding, hadn't drawn attention to himself. His salt and pepper hair was combed back, his tie knotted perfectly. He looked like just another businessman catching a flight. Except he wasn't. He'd seen Sarah brush off Edith. He'd heard her sharp tone. And now, as the plane taxied toward the runway, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a quick message. His thumb hovered over the send button for a moment before pressing it. The engines roared to life, drowning out the chatter in the cabin. Passengers settled back, seatbelts clicked, and the plane picked up speed. Edith gazed out the window, watching the tarmac blur past. Sarah adjusted her uniform in the galley, confident she had everything under control. Jake shifted in his seat, still bothered by what he'd seen. None of them knew it yet, but this flight was about to change everything. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the hum of the engines settling into a steady drone. Outside, the sky stretched endless and blue, clouds drifting lazily below. Inside, passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, flipped open magazines, or tapped at their screens. The cabin felt calm, routine, except it wasn't. Something was brewing, quiet, and unnoticed by most, but growing all the same. Sarah Klein moved through first class with her usual grace, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted floor. She carried a tray of drinks, sparkling water for the businessman in 2A, a coffee for the woman in 3C. Her smile was bright, her voice warm as she leaned down to check on them. "Anything else you need?" she asked, her tone smooth and professional. The businessman shook his head, already back to his laptop. The woman murmured a quick no, thanks, and Sarah straightened up, satisfied. This was her domain. These were her people, the ones who mattered. Back in business class, Edith Grayson sat by the window, her hands resting lightly on her lap. The sunlight streamed through the glass, catching the silver in her hair. She didn't fuss with her tray table or call for attention. She just watched the world below, her expression unreadable. Jake Harper, seated beside her, shifted uncomfortably. He couldn't shake what had happened earlier, Sarah brushing off Edith like she was nothing. It gnawed at him, though he wasn't sure why. Up ahead, Sarah laughed lightly at something a first-class passenger said, her blonde bun glinting under the cabin lights. She was in her element, chatting with a man in a tailored suit who'd just asked for a second napkin. "Of course, sir," she said, handing it over with a practiced smile. As she turned to head back to the galley, a junior flight attendant, Lily Carter, stepped into her path. Lily was newer, barely 6 months on the job, her dark hair tied back in a simple ponytail. She hesitated, her voice low. "Hey, Sarah, did you see that lady in AP earlier? The older one?" She was struggling with her seatbelt. Sarah's smile tightened for a split second. She glanced at Lily, then shrugged. "Yeah, I saw her. What about it?" Lily shifted her weight, uneasy. Shouldn't someone have helped her?" Sarah let out a quiet scoff, barely loud enough for anyone else to hear. "Lily, we can't hold everyone's hand. It's a seatbelt. She'll figure it out." She brushed past Lily, her tray still in hand, and disappeared into the galley. Lily frowned, staring after her. She didn't argue. Sarah was senior, and Lily knew her place, but something about it didn't sit right. She'd seen how Sarah fawned over first class, how she picked and chose who got her attention. Edith hadn't made the cut. Jake caught the tail end of the exchange from his seat. He leaned toward Edith, keeping his voice low. "She should have helped you," he muttered, his brow furrowing. "It's her job." Edith turned her head slightly, her brown eyes meeting his. A small smile played on her lips, soft but knowing. "People show who they are in the little things," she said quietly. "No need to force it. They'll do it on their own." Jake blinked, caught off guard by her words. There was no bitterness in her tone, no anger, just a calm certainty that made his stomach twist. "You're not mad?" he asked. Edith's smile widened just a touch. "Why would I be? She's only hurting herself." He leaned back, exhaling through his nose. Something about her stillness, her confidence, made him uneasy, like she knew something he didn't. He glanced up the aisle again. Sarah was back in first class, pouring a glass of orange juice for a woman in a silk scarf. She didn't even look toward business class. Jake shook his head. "Still doesn't feel right," he said under his breath. A few rows ahead, Richard Tate sat quietly in his first-class seat. His dark suit blended into the plush upholstery, his salt and pepper hair catching the light as he sipped a glass of water. He hadn't spoken much since takeoff, just nodded politely when Sarah offered him a drink earlier. But his gray eyes missed nothing. He'd seen Edith board the plane, watched her struggle with the seatbelt, heard Sarah's sharp dismissal. He'd noticed Jake stepping in, too. Richard didn't react, not with a word or a glance, but his mind was working. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved quickly, tapping out a short message. "Passenger in 8B, business class. Elderly woman. Ignored by crew when asking for help. Notable." He paused, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then he added one more line, watching closely. He hit send and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression unchanged. The man next to him, busy with a newspaper, didn't notice a thing. Back in 8B, Edith adjusted her coat sleeve, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't seem bothered by Sarah's attitude or the whispers starting to ripple through the cabin. A woman across the aisle, Clara Hughes, mid-40s with short brown hair, leaned toward her husband, Ben. "Did you see that?" she murmured, nodding toward Edith. The attendant didn't even try to help her. Ben shrugged, his eyes on his book. "Not our business, Clara." Clara frowned, but didn't push it. She stole another glance at Edith, who sat as calm as ever. There was something about her, a quiet strength, that stuck with Clara, even if she couldn't place it. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, smooth and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign is off, and you're free to move about the cabin. Our crew will start service soon." The announcement ended with a soft chime, and the plane settled into its rhythm. Sarah emerged from the galley, tray in hand, her focus still on first class. She didn't spare a thought for Edith or Lily's words. To her, the flight was going perfectly. She had the important passengers happy, and that was what counted. She didn't know that Richard Tate's message had already reached someone high up, someone who could change everything. Jake glanced at Edith again, her words echoing in his head. People show who they are in the little things. He didn't know why, but he had a feeling this flight wasn't going to end the way Sarah expected. And Edith? She just kept staring out the window, like she already knew how it would all play out. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky, the hum of the engines a steady heartbeat beneath the chatter of passengers. The cabin lights glowed softly, casting a warm hue over the seats. Most people were settled now, some dozing, others sipping drinks or flipping through in-flight magazines. It felt like any other flight, but up in the cockpit, the air was about to get a lot heavier. Tom Delaney, the flight supervisor, stood near the radio panel, his broad shoulders filling out his crisp Horizon Airlines uniform. He was a no-nonsense guy, in his late 40s, with short black hair starting to gray at the edges. He'd worked hundreds of flights, seen it all. Drunk passengers, crying kids, even a medical emergency or two. But when the radio crackled to life with a call from the airline's executive office, something in his gut tightened. He pressed the headset closer to his ear, listening as the voice on the other end spoke in clipped, urgent tones. "Tom, we got a situation," the voice said. It was Greg Simmons, one of the senior managers back at headquarters. "You got a VIP on board. Seat 8B, business class. Edith Grayson." Tom's brow furrowed, his fingers pausing over the clipboard in his hand. Edith Grayson? He repeated, keeping his voice low. Who's that? There was a pause, then Greg's tone sharpened. The Edith Grayson, founder and owner of Horizon Airlines. The words hit like a punch. Tom's face stiffened, his eyes flicking toward the cockpit door. He turned to Captain Daniel Pierce, who sat in the pilot's seat, hands steady on the controls. Daniel was older, pushing 60, with a weathered face and a calm demeanor that came from years in the sky. He glanced back at Tom, catching the shift in his expression. What's going on? Daniel asked, his voice even but curious. Tom took a slow breath, lowering the headset. We've got Edith Grayson on board, he said. Seat 8B. She owns the airline. Daniel's hands froze on the controls for a split second before he recovered, leaning back in his chair. You're kidding, he said, though his tone made it clear he knew Tom wasn't. He pressed his fingers against the armrest, his mind racing. Business class? No one told us. Tom shook his head grimly. Nope. No heads up. She's just there. The cockpit fell silent, the weight of it sinking in. Edith Grayson wasn't just some big shot. She was the big shot. She'd started Horizon Airlines decades ago, built it from a tiny operation into the sprawling company it was today. She was a legend, even if she kept a low profile these days. And now she was sitting in 8B on their flight with no fanfare, no warning. Daniel exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. This isn't good. Tom nodded, his jaw tight. It gets worse. They're saying she asked for help earlier with her seatbelt and got ignored. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Ignored? By who? Tom didn't answer right away. He turned back to the radio panel, flipping through the passenger manifest on his clipboard. His eyes scanned the list of crew members assigned to the flight, landing on one name, Sarah Klein. He tapped it with his finger, his expression darkening. Sarah, he muttered. She's been working business class. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face, letting out a low groan. Of course it's Sarah. He'd flown with her plenty of times. She was good at her job, great with the first-class crowd, but she had a habit of picking her battles. And her passengers. Has anyone checked on how she's been treated so far? Tom hesitated, then nodded toward the communications officer seated at the back of the cockpit. Ethan Brooks was younger, barely 30, with a mop of curly brown hair and a nervous energy. He'd been half listening, his fingers hovering over his console. Ethan, Tom said, you got anything? Ethan cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. Yeah, he said, his voice shaky. I got a message from one of our ground staff monitoring the flight. They said the passenger in 8B, Edith, asked for help with her seatbelt right after boarding. And no one helped her. She got brushed off. The cockpit went quiet again, thicker this time. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. Brushed off by who? Ethan swallowed, glancing at Tom before answering. They didn't say a name, but it was a senior attendant in business class. That's Sarah's section. Tom's jaw clenched. He set the clipboard down with a soft thud, crossing his arms over his chest. Great, he said, the word dripping with sarcasm. Just great. Daniel shook his head, his expression grim. This isn't just a slip-up, Tom. This is Edith Grayson. If she's unhappy, heads roll. And we didn't even know she was here. Tom nodded, his mind already spinning through what came next. The execs want us to handle it, he said. They're watching this flight now. Every move we make. Daniel raised an eyebrow. They want a report? More than that, Tom said. They want it fixed. Now, before we land. Ethan piped up, his voice hesitant. Should we tell the crew? I mean, they don't even know who she is. Tom rubbed the back of his neck, thinking it over. He reached for the crew intercom, his fingers hovering over the button. Not yet, he said finally. I need to talk to Sarah first. See what she says. If this is as bad as it sounds, we've got a problem. Daniel snorted softly. We've already got a problem. Sarah's about to have a bigger one. Tom didn't argue. He knew Daniel was right. Sarah Klein had a reputation. Confident, polished, but too selective with her attention. She'd probably dismissed Edith without a second thought, figuring she wasn't worth the effort. And now that choice was about to catch up with her. All right, Tom said, straightening up. I'll deal with Sarah. Ethan, keep an ear on the ground staff. Let me know if anything else comes through. Daniel, you good here? The captain nodded, his eyes back on the controls. Yeah, Just don't let this blow up worse than it already has. Tom gave a tight smile. No promises. He turned toward the cockpit door, his hand on the handle. He didn't know exactly what he'd find when he confronted Sarah, but one thing was clear. This flight wasn't staying quiet much longer. Out in the cabin, Sarah poured another drink, oblivious to the storm heading her way. Edith Grayson sat calmly in 8B, her hands folded, waiting. And in first class, Richard Tate checked his phone, a faint flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. The pieces were moving, and no one saw the board yet, except him. The galley was a small, cramped space at the back of the plane, filled with the faint clink of glassware and the hum of the engines vibrating through the walls. Sarah Klein stood there, adjusting a tray of drinks with her usual precision. She'd just poured a soda for a first-class passenger, her mind already on the next task, keeping the elite travelers happy. That was her focus, her rhythm. She didn't notice the shift in the air until the crew intercom buzzed, cutting through the quiet. Sarah Klein, report to the galley immediately. Tom Delaney's voice said, firm and clipped. It wasn't loud or angry, but something about it made her pause. She frowned, setting the tray down. A call like that wasn't unusual, maybe a passenger complaint or a mix-up with the drink orders, but the tone felt off. She brushed it off, smoothing her uniform before stepping fully into the galley. Tom was already there, waiting. His arms were crossed over his chest, his face unreadable but stern. Lily Carter lingered near the corner, clutching a stack of napkins, her eyes darting between Tom and Sarah. The air felt thick, like the moment before a storm breaks. Sarah forced a polite smile, tilting her head. "You needed me?" she asked, keeping her voice light. Tom didn't waste time. "Do you know who's sitting in 8B?" he asked, his tone sharp, leaving no room for dodging. Sarah's brows knitted together. 8B. She crossed her arms, mirroring him without realizing it. "Business class?" The older lady with the brown coat. Tom's gaze hardened. "Yeah, her. That's Edith Grayson." The name didn't click at first. Sarah blinked, shaking her head slightly. "I don't." "Edith Grayson." Tom cut in, his voice dropping lower. "The founder and owner of Horizon Airlines." The words slammed into her like a cold wave. Her breath caught, her arms falling limp at her sides. For a second, she just stared at Tom, her mind scrambling to catch up. Edith Grayson, the woman who'd built this airline from nothing. The woman whose name was on every plane, every uniform, including the one Sarah was wearing. And she'd been sitting in 8B, asking for help with her seatbelt. Sarah's stomach twisted as the memory rushed back. Her own voice, sharp and dismissive. "It's just a seatbelt, ma'am. You'll get it." She'd walked away. She hadn't even looked back. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Tom watched her, his eyes narrowing as the realization sank in. "The executive team knows," he said, stepping closer. "The captain knows. They're watching every move we make on this flight now. And I need to know exactly what happened between you and her. Everything." Sarah's mind raced, grasping for something, anything to say. Her instincts kicked in, the same ones that had gotten her through 6 years of tricky passengers and tough shifts. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said quickly, her voice louder than she meant it to be. She was struggling with her seatbelt. "It wasn't a big deal. I told her how to do it." A scoff came from the corner. Lily, still holding the napkins, shook her head, her lips pressed tight. Tom turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "You were there?" he asked. Lily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the stack. She glanced at Sarah, then back at Tom, nodding slowly. "Yeah," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I saw it." Mrs. Grayson asked for help, and Sarah just walked away. Sarah's jaw clenched, heat rising in her cheeks. "I was busy," she snapped, glaring at Lily. "I had first-class passengers to deal with." Lily flinched but didn't back down. "You had time to chat with them," she said quietly. "You were laughing with that guy in 2A right after." The words stung, sharp and true. Sarah's usual confidence wavered, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She wanted to argue, to say Lily was wrong, but the memory was too clear, her turning her back on Edith, brushing her off like she was nothing. And now that nothing was the woman who owned the airline she worked for. Her chest tightened, a mix of panic and shame creeping in. Tom exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "Sarah, this isn't about some random passenger," he said, his voice growing harder. "This is Edith Grayson. You ignored the one person on this plane we can't afford to ignore. And now you're going to fix it." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Fix it?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "What do you mean?" "You're going to go back to 8B, Tom said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And you're going to apologize. Right now." Her stomach dropped. Right now, Tom confirmed. "And you'd better do it right. No excuses, no attitude. Because if you don't, you might not have a job when we land." The warning hung heavy in the air. Sarah's hands shook slightly, her nails digging into her palms. She'd never felt so cornered. Not in all her years on this job. She'd always been the one in control, the one who decided how things went. But not now. Now, she had no choice. Lily shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Sarah's glare. Tom stepped back, his arms crossing again. "Go," he said simply. Sarah took a shaky breath, forcing her shoulders straight. She turned toward the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor as she stepped out of the galley. The walk to 8B felt endless, every step heavier than the last. Passengers glanced her way, some curious, some indifferent, but to her, it felt like they all knew. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with what she'd say. An apology. She could do that. She had to. Up ahead, Edith sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, gazing out the window. Jake Harper lounged beside her, his hoodie pulled up, watching Sarah approach with a flicker of interest. Sarah clenched her fists tighter, her pride screaming at her to turn back. But Tom's words echoed in her head. "You might not have a job when we land." She couldn't risk that. She stopped beside 8B, her breath uneven, her forced smile wobbling. This was it, the moment she'd never seen coming. And somewhere deep down, she knew it wasn't going to go the way she hoped. Sarah Klein's heels clicked against the cabin floor, each step echoing in her ears like a drumbeat. The aisle stretched out ahead, longer than it had ever felt before. Passengers rustled in their seats, some glancing up from their phones, others pretending not to notice her. But Sarah felt their eyes anyway, prickling her skin as she approached seat 8B. Her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides, her forced smile twitching. She could still hear Tom's warning ringing in her head. "Do it right, or you might not have a job when we land." She had to fix this. She had to. Edith Grayson sat by the window, her brown coat draped over her shoulders, a magazine open in her lap. She flipped a page slowly, her silver hair catching the light. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge Sarah's approach. She didn't need to. There was a stillness about her, a quiet power that made Sarah's stomach twist tighter with every step. Jake Harper slouched beside her, his gray hoodie pulled low, his sharp eyes flicking toward Sarah. He didn't say anything, but the corner of his mouth twitched, like he knew something was coming. Sarah stopped beside 8B, her breath shallow. She clasped her hands in front of her, trying to steady them, and forced her voice to stay calm. "Mrs. Grayson," she said, her tone softer than usual. I wanted to apologize for earlier." Edith didn't look up. She turned another page of her magazine, her fingers moving with deliberate care. "Apologize for what, dear?" she asked, her voice gentle but edged with something that made Sarah freeze. The question threw her off. She'd expected Edith to nod, maybe smile, accept the apology so she could walk away and pretend this never happened. Instead, Edith's calm response felt like a trap. Sarah shifted her weight, her smile faltering. "For not helping you with your seatbelt when you asked," she said, rushing the words out. "I didn't mean to ignore you. I was just—" Edith raised a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Think carefully before you finish that," she said, her tone still soft but firm. She finally lifted her gaze, her brown eyes locking onto Sarah's. There was no anger in them, no harshness, just a steady, piercing look that made Sarah feel small. Sarah's throat tightened. She'd talked her way out of plenty of situations before. Angry passengers, annoyed supervisors. But this was different. Her usual tricks wouldn't work here. She swallowed hard, her mind scrambling. "I didn't mean to upset you," she said, quieter now. "I was busy." Edith tilted her head slightly, studying her. "Busy," she repeated, the word hanging between them. "You weren't busy, were you?" Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but Edith kept going, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "You had time to pour drinks, time to talk with the passengers up front, time to decide who deserved your help and who didn't." She paused, letting it sink in. "But when I asked for something simple, you decided I wasn't worth it." The words hit Sarah like a slap, sharp and cold. She wanted to argue, to say it wasn't like that, but the truth was right there in Edith's eyes. She had decided Edith didn't matter, because she was old, because she wasn't first class, because she didn't fit Sarah's idea of important. Her face burned, her hands trembling at her sides. She never felt so exposed. Jake chuckled under his breath, a low sound that snapped Sarah's attention to him. She glared, her voice sharp before she could stop it. "Something funny?" Jake raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his seat. "Just think it's funny how you only care now that you know who she is," he said, his tone casual but cutting. Sarah stiffened, the sting of his words sinking deep. She wanted to snap back, to tell him to mind his own business, but she couldn't, because he was right. If Edith had been anyone else, just some random old lady, she wouldn't have cared. She'd have walked away and forgotten about it by now. But Edith wasn't anyone else, and that changed everything. Edith closed her magazine with a soft snap, resting it on the tray table. She let out a quiet breath, like the conversation had already gone on too long. "Apologies don't mean much when they're only because you're scared," she said simply, her eyes still on Sarah. Sarah's chest tightened, a lump forming in her throat. She'd expected yelling, maybe a demand for better treatment, something she could brush off or fix with a quick smile. Instead, Edith was making her sit with her own mistake, forcing her to see it for what it was. She opened her mouth, desperate to salvage this. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I really am." Edith didn't respond right away. She reached for her water glass, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. "You should get back to your work, Miss Klein," she said, her voice calm but final. Sarah's face flushed hot, her pride screaming at her to say something. Anything to defend herself. But there was nothing left. No clever comeback. No way to twist this in her favor. Passengers nearby were starting to notice. Clara Hughes, sitting across the aisle, nudged her husband, Ben, whispering she's not letting her off easy. Ben sighed, his eyes still on his book, but even he glanced up for a second. Sarah could feel their stares, the quiet judgment creeping in. It was the same judgment she'd tossed at others. Passengers she'd dismissed, complaints she'd ignored. Now it was aimed at her, and it burned. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She started, but Edith cut her off again. "You should get back to your work," Edith repeated, her tone unchanged. Sarah's jaw tightened. She wanted to argue, to push back, but she knew it was pointless. Without another word, she turned sharply and stormed down the aisle, her steps quick and unsteady. Her heart pounded, humiliation settling deep in her gut. She'd gone to apologize, to fix things, and instead, she'd made it worse, exposed herself in front of everyone. Back in 8B, Edith took another sip of water, her expression as calm as ever. Jake watched Sarah disappear into the galley, then glanced at Edith. "She's not going to forget this," he muttered, shaking his head. Edith's lips curved slightly, the faintest hint of a smile. "No," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet certainty. "She won't." The plane hummed on, the tension rippling through the cabin like a hidden current. Sarah thought she'd hit rock bottom, but she didn't know the half of it yet. Edith, though, she knew. She'd seen this story play out before, and she wasn't done teaching the lesson. Sarah Klein burst into the galley, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles whitening as she steadied herself. The hum of the plane's engines filled the small space, but it couldn't drown out the storm raging in her head. She'd gone 8B to fix things, to smooth it over with a quick apology, and instead, Edith Grayson had turned it back on her, calmly, quietly, like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. Her chest burned with a mix of anger and shame, her mind replaying Edith's words. Apologies don't mean much when they're only because you're scared. Lily Carter stood near the drink station, arranging cups in neat rows. She glanced up as Sarah stormed in, her dark ponytail swinging slightly. "You okay?" she asked, her voice cautious. Sarah shot her a glare, her voice snapping like a whip. "I don't need your pity, Lily." She yanked a napkin from the stack on the counter, twisting it between her fingers. "I'm fine." Lily shifted, her hands pausing over the cups. "I wasn't." She stopped, pressing her lips together. Then, softer, she tried again. "I was just asking if you get what happened out there." Sarah's head whipped toward her, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, I get it," she hissed. "I got humiliated by some old lady who thinks she's better than me because she owns this airline. That's what happened." Lily flinched, her fingers tightening around a cup. "You might want to stop there," she said, her tone firming up. "She's not just some old lady, Sarah. She's the reason we're all here. She built Horizon Airlines, and you treated her like she didn't matter." Sarah froze, the napkin crumpling in her fist. She wanted to argue, to snap back that Lily didn't know what she was talking about, but the words stuck in her throat. Because Lily was right. Edith Grayson wasn't just a passenger. She was the airline itself, and Sarah had dismissed her like she was nothing. The realization twisted deeper, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Before she could respond, the crew intercom buzzed, sharp and sudden. Tom Delaney's voice cut through the galley, colder than before. "All senior flight attendants, report to the galley now." Lily's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "That's not normal," she muttered. Sarah's pulse spiked. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not." Seconds later, the galley door swung open, and two other senior attendants stepped in, Mark Evans and Tara Lee. Mark was tall, with a shaved head and a quiet demeanor, while Tara's sharp eyes scanned the room, her black hair pulled into a tight braid. They exchanged quick, silent glances, sensing the tension. Tom followed right behind them, his broad frame filling the doorway. His face was a mask, giving nothing away, but his posture said it all. This wasn't a casual check-in. "The executive office just sent a directive," Tom announced, his voice flat but heavy. "When we land, every interaction with Mrs. Grayson is getting reviewed by the board." Sarah's stomach plummeted, the air rushing out of her lungs. "Reviewed," she echoed, her voice shaky despite her effort to hide it. "By who?" Tom's jaw tightened. "The board of executives. The top. All of them." A thick silence swallowed the galley. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, frowning. "Wait, why now?" he asked. "She didn't complain, did she?" Tom shook his head, his eyes flicking to Sarah. "No, she didn't have to. Someone else did." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her hands trembling around the crumpled napkin. "Who?" she asked, barely breathing. Tom's gaze locked onto hers, unyielding. "Richard Tate." The name hit her like a brick. Richard Tate, the quiet businessman in first class, the one she'd barely noticed beyond offering him a drink. He'd been there the whole time, watching, saying nothing. And now he'd gone straight to the top. Sarah's knees felt weak, the blood draining from her face. She'd ignored Edith Grayson, and Richard Tate, someone with real pull, had seen it all. He sent a message to corporate. Tom continued, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. Said one of our crew publicly dismissed the owner of Horizon Airlines. And now they're waiting to see how we handle it when we land. Mark let out a low whistle, shaking his head. Tara crossed her arms, her lips pressing into a thin line. Lily swallowed hard, her eyes darting to Sarah, who stood frozen, her mind racing. This wasn't just embarrassment anymore. This was her career, 6 years of work, hanging by a thread. Tom adjusted his uniform, his tone turning icy. "So here's my advice. Do your jobs right for the rest of this flight. Be professional, especially you, Sarah." Sarah's jaw clenched, her nails digging into her palms. She gave a stiff nod, unable to speak. Tom turned toward the door, then paused, glancing back at her. "Because when we land," he said, his voice dropping, "you're going to answer for this. All of it." He walked out, leaving the galley in stunned silence. Mark and Tara exchanged another look, then followed without a word. Lily stayed put, her gaze lingering on Sarah. "You should have seen this coming," she said quietly, almost to herself. Sarah's head snapped toward her, fury flaring. "What am I supposed to do, Lily?" she muttered, her voice breaking. "What am I supposed to do?" Lily hesitated, then stepped closer, her voice steady. "Maybe stop trying to fix it and start figuring out why it happened." Sarah stared at her, the words sinking in like stones. She wanted to yell, to shove Lily away, to pretend this wasn't real, but she couldn't. The plane hummed on, steady and uncaring, as the truth settled around her. She thought she could talk her way out of anything. She'd been wrong. Out in the cabin, passengers sipped their drinks, oblivious to the chaos unfolding behind the scenes. Edith Grayson sat calmly in 8B, her hands folded, her face serene. Jake Harper glanced at her, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "They're freaking out now, aren't they?" he said under his breath. Edith didn't answer, just kept staring out the window. But the faintest flicker of a smile crossed her face. The fallout was spreading, and Sarah Klein was only starting to feel the heat. The plane tilted slightly, a subtle shift that pressed against the passengers' ears as it began its descent. The cabin lights dimmed, and the soft rattle of overhead bins broke the steady hum of the engines. Outside, the sky darkened, streaks of orange and purple painting the horizon. Inside, the mood was anything but calm. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that rippled through the rows of seats. Sarah Klein sat strapped into her jump seat near the galley, her hands locked tight around the armrests. Her navy uniform was still crisp, her blonde bun intact, but her face betrayed her, pale, eyes wide, lips pressed into a thin line. She stared straight ahead, her mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. Tom's words echoed in her head. "You're going to answer for this. All of it. Suspension? Firing? Worse." She'd spent 6 years building her career with Horizon Airlines, climbing her way to senior attendant, and now it was slipping away, all because of one moment, one choice. She glanced toward the galley, where Lily Carter was securing the last of the drink carts. Lily caught her eye and paused, her expression neutral. "You should buckle up tight," she said, her voice flat. "We're landing soon." Sarah shot her a look, sharp but fleeting. "I know," she muttered, her fingers digging deeper into the armrests. She didn't need Lily's advice. She just needed this flight to be over. But even that thought made her stomach twist. Landing didn't mean escape. It meant facing whatever was waiting for her. Up near the flight deck, Tom Delaney leaned against the wall, speaking in low tones with Mark Evans. Their voices were too quiet to hear, but Sarah didn't need to catch the words. She could tell it was about her. Mark's furrowed brow, Tom's stiff nod. She looked away quickly, her chest tightening. She'd always been untouchable, the one who handled everything with a smile and a quip. Now she was the problem, and everyone knew it. The cabin stirred as passengers adjusted their seats, clicking seatbelts back into place. A few rows back in business class, Edith Grayson sat by the window, her brown coat folded neatly over her lap. She gazed out at the fading light, her face as calm as it had been since takeoff. Jake Harper slumped beside her, his hoodie pulled up, scrolling through his phone. He glanced at Edith, his voice low. "You knew this was going to happen, didn't you?" Edith didn't turn, but a small smile tugged at her lips. "People show themselves when they think no one's watching," she said softly. "But someone always is." Jake exhaled, shaking his head. "She's freaking out up there," he said, nodding toward the front where Sarah Saturday. "You can see it." Edith's smile grew just a touch. "Good," she murmured, her tone steady. "Let her." Across the aisle, Clara Hughes leaned toward her husband, Ben, her voice a hushed whisper. "She looks like she's about to crack," she said, her eyes flicking to Sarah. Ignoring that woman really messed her up. Ben sighed, closing his book. "She should have thought about that before," he muttered. "People notice when you act like you're above them." Clara nodded, stealing another glance at Edith. There was something about her, something quiet but unshakable, that made the whole scene feel bigger than it should have. She didn't look mad or smug. She just was. The intercom crackled to life, Captain Daniel Pierce's voice filling the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're starting our descent. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your seats are upright. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." His tone was smooth, professional like always, but Sarah felt it like a countdown. She shifted in her jump seat, her eyes darting toward the small window near the front. Through the glass, she caught a glimpse of the jet bridge, and then she saw them. Two figures in dark uniforms stood waiting, their outlines blurry but unmistakable. Security. Her breath hitched, her heart slamming against her ribs. Security didn't show up for nothing. This wasn't just a review or a slap on the wrist. This was serious. Her hands tightened on the armrests, nails digging into the fabric. She wanted to stand, to run, to do something, anything, but she couldn't. She was strapped in, trapped, with nowhere to go but down. The plane dipped lower, the city lights below growing brighter, closer. Every second stretched out, her mind racing. Had Richard Tate done this? Had Edith said something after all? Or was this just the airline's way of making an example out of her? Back in 8B, Jake pocketed his phone, glancing at Edith again. "You think she's done for?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Edith adjusted her coat, her movements slow and deliberate. "She's not done," she said quietly. "Not yet, but she's learning." Jake smirked, leaning back. "Learning the hard way." Edith didn't reply, just kept watching the window as the ground came into view. The plane's wheels whirred as the landing gear deployed, a soft thud vibrating through the cabin. Passengers braced themselves, some gripping armrests, others barely noticing, but Sarah felt every jolt like it was aimed at her. Up in first class, Richard Tate sat with his arms crossed, his gray eyes fixed on the seat back in front of him. He'd made the call, sent the message that set this all in motion. He didn't need to say a word now. His work was done. Edith hadn't asked him to step in, hadn't needed to. She'd commanded respect without a single demand, and he'd made sure the airline knew it. The tires screeched against the runway, the plane shuddering as it slowed. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the captain's next announcement. She didn't hear the "welcome to your destination" or the local time. All she could think about was those security officers waiting outside. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers stood, reaching for their bags, but Sarah stayed frozen, her hands still locked on the armrests. Tom stepped out of the galley, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, unreadable moment. "Get ready," he said, his voice low. "It's almost time." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. The flight was over, but her nightmare was just beginning. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate, the engines winding down with a soft whine. The cabin filled with the familiar sounds of arrival, seatbelts clicking open, overhead bins popping, passengers stretching and chatting as they grabbed their bags. The jet bridge locked into place with a dull thud, and the seatbelt sign blinked off. For most, it was just another landing. For Sarah Klein, it was the end of the line. She sat rigid in her jump seat, her hands still clamped around the armrests. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, her breath shallow and quick. Through the small window beside her, she saw them again. Two security officers standing just beyond the jet bridge, their dark uniforms stark against the terminal's bright lights. They weren't moving, just waiting, their faces unreadable. Sarah's stomach lurched. This wasn't a coincidence. They were here for her. The cabin door hissed open, letting in a rush of cool air that did nothing to calm her nerves. Passengers shuffled toward the exit, their voices a low hum of excitement or exhaustion. Sarah stayed put, her legs locked in place, until Tom Delaney stepped out of the galley. His broad frame loomed over her, his expression as neutral as ever. "Sarah," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "Come with me." Her stomach dropped. She forced herself to stand, her knees wobbling beneath her. "Is this really happening?" she muttered, more to herself than to him. Tom didn't answer, just nodded toward the door. She took a shaky breath, smoothing her uniform out of habit, and followed him. The walk down the aisle felt like a march to her own execution. Passengers parted around her, some glancing curiously, others too busy with their luggage to care. But she felt every stare, every whisper like needles in her skin. As she passed 8B, she couldn't help it. Her eyes flicked toward Edith Grayson. The older woman sat calmly, her brown coat draped over her arm, flipping through her magazine like nothing had happened. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge Sarah's presence. But just as Sarah moved past, Edith's voice slipped out, soft and steady. "I told you," she murmured, not lifting her eyes. "People show who they are when they think no one's watching." Sarah's throat tightened, her steps faltering for a split second. The words cut deeper than any shout, any insult. She wanted to turn back, to say something, anything, but her pride was in shreds, and her voice wouldn't come. She kept walking, her heels clicking faster now, her face burning. Jake Harper watched her go, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. He leaned back in his seat, pulling his hoodie tighter. "That's gotta sting," he said under his breath, glancing at Edith. Edith didn't respond, just turned another page. She didn't need to. The damage was done. Clara Hughes nudged her husband, Ben, as Sarah passed their row. "Look at her," Clara whispered, her voice low but sharp. "She knows she's in trouble now." Ben sighed, folding his book shut. "She brought it on herself," he said, his tone matter of fact. "You don't ignore someone like that and walk away clean." Sarah caught the edge of their words, her humiliation swelling. She'd spent years judging passengers, deciding who deserved her time. Now they were judging her, and she had no defense. She kept her head down, following Tom toward the exit, the weight of the cabin pressing in from all sides. The jet bridge stretched ahead, a tunnel of dim light and muffled sounds. The moment Sarah stepped onto it, the cool air hit her face, sharp and unforgiving. Tom stayed a step ahead, silent, guiding her toward the terminal. The two security officers straightened as she approached, their presence looming larger now. They weren't aggressive, didn't grab her or bark orders, but they didn't have to. Just being there was enough. Sarah's pulse raced, her hands clenching into fists. "Is this necessary?" she asked, her voice cracking despite her effort to sound steady. One of the officers, a tall man with a buzzed head, met her gaze. "The executive board requested a review of your conduct on this flight," he said, his tone flat. "You're being escorted for questioning." Her nails dug into her palms, a sharp sting cutting through her panic. "Questioning," she echoed, her voice barely audible. She glanced at Tom, searching for some sign of reassurance, but he just stepped aside, his face unreadable. "They'll explain what's next," he said, then turned back toward the plane. Sarah's breath hitched. She was alone now, flanked by the officers as they led her forward. The terminal doors slid open ahead, revealing a bustling airport. Passengers rushing to gates, flight crews chatting, the world she'd been part of for years. But it didn't feel like hers anymore. It felt distant, like she was already an outsider. As they neared a cluster of private meeting rooms off the main concourse, she spotted them, suits, standing in a tight group. Henry Brooks, a senior executive with Horizon Airlines, stood at the center. His tall frame and slick-back hair made him unmistakable, his hands clasped behind his back in quiet authority. Beside him was Richard Tate, the businessman from first class, his gray eyes fixed on her with a calm, steady intensity. Sarah's stomach twisted into knots. They were waiting for her. Henry's gaze locked onto hers as she approached, his expression cold and unyielding. Richard didn't move, didn't speak, just watched, like he'd been watching all along. Sarah forced her shoulders back, trying to hold onto some shred of dignity, but it was slipping fast. She'd ignored Edith Grayson because she hadn't known who she was. Richard Tate had known the whole time, and now he was here to see her pay for it. The officers stopped outside a glass-walled meeting room, the tinted panes hiding whatever waited inside. "This way," the tall one said, gesturing toward the door. Sarah hesitated, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to run, to rewind the clock, to undo that one stupid moment when she'd brushed off Edith's request. But it was too late. She stepped forward, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that made her flinch. The plane was emptying out now, passengers streaming into the terminal, oblivious to the drama unfolding just beyond their sight. Edith Grayson stood slowly from 8B, slipping her coat over her shoulders, her face serene. Jake followed, stretching as he grabbed his bag. "Guess that's that," he said, glancing at her. Edith adjusted her purse, her voice soft but sure. "Not quite," she said. "She's got more to learn." And as Sarah disappeared into the meeting room, flanked by suits and security, she knew Edith was right. This was only the beginning of her reckoning. The glass door of the conference room clicked shut behind Sarah Klein, sealing her inside with a soft, final thud. The room was small but sharp, tinted walls, a long table, and a handful of Horizon Airlines executives seated in stiff chairs. The air smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, but it felt cold, sterile. Sarah stood at the far end, her legs unsteady beneath her, flanked by the two security officers who'd escorted her from the jet bridge. Her navy uniform felt too tight, her blonde bun pulling at her scalp. She'd never been so aware of her own breathing, shallow, shaky, loud in her ears. Henry Brooks sat at the head of the table, his tall frame straight and commanding. His dark suit was crisp, his hair slicked back, and his hands rested on a thin folder in front of him. His sharp blue eyes locked on his Sarah, unblinking like he'd already made up his mind. Beside him, Richard Tate leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his gray gaze steady and unreadable. Three other executives, two men and a woman in dark suits, sat along the sides, their faces grim, their silence heavy. Tom Delaney stood near the door, arms folded, watching all unfold. Sarah's throat was dry, her hands trembling as she clasped them in front of her. She wanted to sit, to hide, but no one offered her a chair. She was on trial, and she knew it. Henry broke the silence, his voice smooth but cutting. "Miss Klein," he began, flipping open the folder with a flick of his wrist. "Do you know why you're here?" Sarah licked her lips, her mind racing for an answer that wouldn't sound weak. She hesitated, her voice catching. She wanted to defend herself, to say it was all a mistake, but the weight of their stares crushed her usual confidence. "I assume it's about the passenger in 8B, she said finally, forcing the words out. Henry raised an eyebrow, tapping the folder lightly. "The passenger," he repeated, his tone dry. "You mean Edith Grayson?" He didn't wait for her to respond, leaning forward slightly. "Let's stick to the facts. We got a report from Richard Tate." He nodded toward the businessman, "who saw your interaction with Mrs. Grayson firsthand. Care to explain?" Sarah's eyes darted to Richard, but his expression didn't shift. He just watched like he'd been watching all along. She swallowed hard, her palms sweaty. She asked for help with her seatbelt," she said, her voice unsteady. "I told her how to do it. I didn't think it was a big deal." Henry's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not a big deal," he echoed, flipping a page in the folder. "Except she's not just any passenger, is she? She's the woman who built this airline. And you didn't just tell her how to do it. You dismissed her, walked away, ignored her request." Sarah's face burned, the heat creeping up her neck. "I was busy," she said quickly, grasping at the excuse. "I had first-class passengers to—" "Busy," Henry cut in, his voice sharpening. "Busy enough to chat with a man in 2A, according to Mr. Tate. Busy enough to pour drinks and smile for the people you decided mattered. But not busy enough to help the owner of Horizon Airlines with something as simple as a seatbelt." He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Is that about right?" The room went still, the air thick with her own words turned against her. Sarah's hands clenched tighter, her nails biting into her skin. She wanted to argue, to say it wasn't fair, but the truth was laid bare in front of her. She made a choice. Edith hadn't been important enough, and now that choice was choking her. Henry glanced at Richard, then back at Sarah. "Mrs. Grayson didn't complain," he said, his tone softening slightly but not enough to comfort her. "She didn't have to. Mr. Tate saw it. Your own crew saw it. Passengers saw it. And now we're here." Sarah's chest tightened, a lump rising in her throat. "I didn't know who she was," she said, her voice cracking. "If I'd known—" "If you'd known," Henry interrupted, his voice hard again, "you'd have treated her differently. That's the problem, Miss Klein. This airline isn't built on picking who deserves respect. It's built on giving it to every single person who steps on our planes. Young, old, first-class economy. Everyone. He closed the folder with a sharp snap. You forgot that. The words hit her like a slap, stripping away the last of her defenses. She'd spent years believing she could coast by on charm and selective service, that as long as she kept the right people happy, she'd be fine. Now Henry's voice, calm, cold, undeniable, tore that illusion apart. So tell me, he said, leaning forward again, if Mrs. Grayson had just been some regular passenger, no title, no power, would you have cared? Sarah's breath caught, her mind blank. She knew the answer. They all did. No, she wouldn't have cared. She'd have walked away, forgotten it by the next flight, never given it a second thought. The silence stretched, suffocating her, until she couldn't stand it anymore. I made a mistake, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Henry exchanged a look with the woman beside him, who gave a slight nod. He turned back to Sarah, his expression unyielding. You did, and mistakes have consequences. He paused, letting the weight settle. We'll make our final call soon. For now, you're on unpaid suspension, effective immediately. The words crashed into her, stealing the air from her lungs. Suspension, she echoed, her voice trembling. Unpaid, immediately, Henry repeated, closing the folder again. Security will escort you out. You'll get official notice within 48 hours. Sarah's legs felt like they'd give out, her vision blurring at the edges. 6 years gone just like that. She wanted to beg, to plead for another chance, but the look in Henry's eyes told her it wouldn't matter. The decision was made. The security officers stepped forward, one gesturing toward the door. This way, ma'am, he said, his tone flat. She forced herself to move, her body on autopilot. Her heels clicked against the floor as she walked out, the officers close behind. The terminal buzzed outside. Passengers, crews, life going on, but it felt distant, unreal. She'd lost everything in that room, and there was no talking her way out of it. As the door shut behind her, Henry leaned back, glancing at Richard. She didn't see it coming, he said quietly. Richard's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile. Most don't, he replied, his voice low. Not until it's too late. Sarah Klein stepped out of the terminal doors, the cool evening air hitting her like a slap. The automatic glass panels slid shut behind her, cutting off the hum of the airport. The chatter of passengers, the clatter of suitcases, the life she'd been part of for 6 years. She stood there, frozen, her navy uniform wrinkled now, her blonde bun starting to unravel. The world outside moved on. Cars honked, travelers rushed past, but she couldn't. Not yet. Her hand shook as she clutched her phone, the screen dark and silent. No messages, no calls, nothing. She lowered herself onto a metal bench just outside the entrance, the cold seeping through her thin pants. Her breath came in slow, ragged bursts, her mind replaying the hearing. Henry Brooks's cold voice, unpaid suspension, effective immediately. 6 years of work, of climbing, of thinking she was untouchable, gone in a single flight. She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't stop. Security escorting her out. The executive stares. Edith Grayson's quiet, piercing words. It was all too much. The doors slid open again, and Sarah flinched, half expecting security to drag her away. But it was Edith Grayson who stepped out, her brown coat buttoned up, her silver hair neat as ever. She moved with that same steady grace, her small purse tucked under her arm. Jake Harper trailed behind, his hoodie up, hands in his pockets. Sarah's stomach twisted, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to disappear, to avoid the woman who'd unraveled her life without even trying. Edith paused a few feet away, her eyes landing on Sarah. There was no smugness in her gaze, no triumph, just a calm understanding that made Sarah's chest ache. You're still here, Edith said, her voice soft but clear. Sarah's throat tightened. She trailed off, unsure what to say. What could she say? She'd lost everything. Her job, her pride, her control, and Edith was the last person she wanted to face. Edith stepped closer, then, to Sarah's shock, sat beside her on the bench. The older woman adjusted her coat, her movements slow and deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of rolling suitcases and distant announcements filled the space between them. Sarah stared at the pavement, her hands twisting in her lap, waiting for the lecture, the final blow. "You're not the first to misjudge someone," Edith said finally, her tone gentle. "And you won't be the last." Sarah blinked, glancing at her. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't know who you were." Edith exhaled softly, tilting her head. "Didn't you?" she asked, her eyes meeting Sarah's. There was no anger there, no judgment, just a quiet question that cut deeper than any shout. Sarah flinched, the truth sinking in. She hadn't known Edith was the airline's owner, but she'd still chosen to ignore her. She'd looked at an older woman in business class and decided she wasn't worth her time, not because of who she was, but because of who Sarah thought she wasn't. Her shoulders slumped, her voice barely a whisper. "I was doing my job," she tried. I did it my way." "Your way," Edith repeated, her tone firm but not harsh. "You decided who mattered and who didn't. That's not the job, Miss Klein. That's you." The words cracked something inside Sarah, a wall she'd built over years of brushing off complaints, of prioritizing first class, of thinking she could bend the rules. She rubbed her hands over her face, her breath shaky. "And now I've lost everything," she said, more to herself than to Edith. Edith studied her for a moment, then leaned back slightly. "You have a choice," she said. "This moment can break you, or it can change you." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "A choice?" she asked, a bitter edge creeping in. "I'm suspended. I've got nothing left to choose." Edith didn't flinch. "You can sit here and let it end you," she said simply. "Or you can figure out what it means and do better." She stood, smoothing her coat. "Good luck, Miss Klein." Sarah watched her walk away, her small figure disappearing into the crowd. Edith's words lingered, heavy and sharp, refusing to let go. She wanted to dismiss them, to blame Edith for all of this, but she couldn't. This wasn't Edith's doing, it was hers. A familiar voice broke her thoughts. "Didn't expect you'd still be here," Jake Harper said, dropping onto the bench beside her. His hoodie was still up, his hands stuffed in his pockets, but his smirk was gone. Sarah scowled, crossing her arms. "Why do you care?" Jake shrugged. "I don't really. Just curious if you've got some big revenge plan cooking." She let out a dry laugh, short and bitter. "Revenge? Against who?" "Myself." He chuckled, stretching his legs out. "Fair point." He glanced at her, his tone shifting. "You know, most people would have just said sorry and moved on." Meant it, too. Sarah tensed, her jaw tightening. "I tried," she said, her voice sharp. She didn't buy it. "Because you didn't mean it," Jake said, blunt but not cruel. "You were scared, not sorry." She sucked in a breath, the words hitting hard. He was right, again. She'd apologized because she had to, not because she cared. If Edith had been anyone else, she wouldn't have bothered. "So what?" she muttered. "Doesn't matter now." Jake tilted his head, studying her. "Maybe it does." She said, "You've got a choice, right? Maybe this is your shot to figure it out." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Yeah, my big second chance," she said sarcastically. "Tell that to the airline that just kicked me out." He shrugged again, standing up. "Not every suspension's permanent. But sitting here, feeling sorry for yourself? That's on you." He gave her a lazy wave and walked off toward a waiting car, leaving her alone again. Sarah exhaled slowly, pulling out her phone. The blank screen stared back, a mirror of how empty she felt. But Jake's words, and Edith's, stuck with her. She could let this break her, or she could change. Her fingers hovered over the screen, then scrolled to Lily Carter's name. She hesitated, her thumb trembling. Lily had called her out on the plane, told her the truth when no one else would. Maybe she'd listen now. She pressed call. It rang twice before Lily picked up, her voice cautious. "Sarah." "Hey," Sarah said, swallowing her pride. "I need to talk. About how to be better." There was a long pause, then Lily's tone softened. "I'm listening." Sarah closed her eyes, a flicker of something, like hope, stirring inside her. This wasn't the end she'd expected, but maybe it was a start. Thanks for sticking with Sarah's story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this ride, hit that like button and share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.